Hello, today is Thursday, October 8th, 2020. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Companies spend a lot of time planning, designing, and implementing cost effective, resilient technical solutions and programs to support their business needs. This might be, for example, a global network with an SD-WAN overlay. It might be a unified communication solution, or it might even be a corporate mobility program. But how do you guarantee what you are paying for with an increasingly limited IT budget is actually being delivered by your service providers? And what do you do if you find out that it's not? What we're going to do on today's podcast is highlight some of the areas where you better be keeping a watchful eye, or you run the risk of paying for something that your trusted partner might not be delivering. I'm joined by Keith Cook, a fellow director at TC2. And between us, well, we have a few years of experience in this industry and have seen a thing or two that we want to share. Now, we're going to make this a two-part podcast. And in this first episode, we'll identify issues, or maybe I should just say they're opportunities, that you may encounter. And then in part two, we'll tell you what you can do that may help you certify that your provider delivers what you think you bought. Okay, Keith, how about if you start us off? Do you have any examples of where a provider came up a bit short?
Goodness, Joe. I know you like to keep these podcasts to around 10 minutes, but I could go on for hours. Seriously, let me just highlight some of the big ones. The first is something you mentioned in the introduction, the network. In my career, I've seen networks evolve from separate voice and data networks to a converged network, and from the old point-to-point lease lines to frame relay, then to MPLS, and now to today's go-to SD-WAN solutions. These networks are comprised of lots of components provided by lots of suppliers, and that's where and why many of our clients find problems.
So, what are some of the issues?
Well, let me start with a customer's premises, a typical site, if you will, and work outward from there. You need access to connect to a network. Usually it's a fixed line circuit, but sometimes it could be a wireless connection. The issue is that sometimes your supplier can't deliver the access without special construction. And if this applies, it could delay the circuit installation, and that cost could be passed on to you. The same applies to fixed wireless access. Your provider is going to need to do some work, which could cause delays and perhaps a higher cost for you.
And that connection needs to be connected to some equipment like a router or an SD-WAN appliance. Sometimes suppliers have a hard time getting that equipment delivered to a site to meet the installation deadline. Now, this is usually more common when that equipment has to be shipped to a more remote location or maybe to an international site. You know, Keith, I've also had clients complain that they receive refurbished equipment when they buy a managed equipment solution.
That's right, Joe. And yet another issue is with access diversity. A lot of our clients buy multiple connections to a site so that they get this diversity. This could be path diversity or edge diversity in the provider's network, or even chassis diversity in the provider's building. It's hard to get the providers to actually show you the diagrams and prove you're getting this diversity. It's also really difficult to make sure it's maintained over time. The providers, whether this is unintentional or not, groom and change their networks routinely. So the diversity that you thought you had initially may not actually exist at some later point in time.
You know, sadly, you also see that in larger macro networks. How many times, Keith, have we heard some major outage was caused by a single cable cut or a fire in a switching office? All right, so staying with this network theme, SLAs should help keep providers in check, right? I mean, SLAs cover everything from installation to performance to maintenance.
Well, sort of, and in theory. But note that you might think you're getting an SLA, but your provider is actually giving you something called an SLO, a service level objective, not an agreement. And there's a big difference. The SLO doesn't really commit the supplier to anything. They have no skin in the game. This is common when you buy certain types of access technologies, like broadband, for example. The headline speed numbers may look impressive, but the providers don't overbuild their broadband networks, so they can't guarantee your site is always going to get that speed. Often it's some kind of best case or theoretical speed. You may get it sometimes, or even rarely, or worst case, never. Installation SLAs are also sometimes, shall we say, lacking. This is particularly true when you buy international services.
Yeah, you know, that best efforts bandwidth situation that you described for broadband, I've also seen that happen on dedicated internet service where you should expect to get the full bandwidth. If you don't, I mean, what does dedicated mean? Something else that I've seen is where clients pay for priority class of service or priority quality of service, and it just doesn't get delivered, at least not all of it.
Exactly right. And yet another issue that we see sometimes relates to voice over IP or SIP trunking services. Companies need VoIP for their unified communication solutions, but most providers aren't always clear where they can or cannot deliver the service as promised. Sometimes it's because they don't have the network coverage or there are regulatory reasons. Other times the providers lack an in-country partner or the required licenses. The list just goes on. If you don't know this when you're rolling out your UC solution, it can cause some real headaches later.
Yeah, with UC, we see a lot of clients think that they're getting certain features or service bells and whistles, only to find out that it's on the roadmap or that it requires an extra cost or just doesn't work as they expected. Okay, Keith, let's talk about mobility.
Yes, indeed. A lot of companies have corporate sponsored mobility programs. And now, admittedly, the trend in the wireless industry has made it a bit easier to deal with these days. It doesn't seem like there are nearly as many plans to mess around with compared to, say, 5, 10 years ago. And most companies seem to have landed on certain device types and operating systems.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, a lot of plans today have all inclusive voice and messaging, and they do include a healthy amount of data. The problem is usually in the detail. So, for example, pooling user data can really help keep costs in check and avoid overage charges. But clients, they don't always pool as effectively as they can. And that's often because of the provider's billing requirements or limitations. Another issue is with an unlimited data plan. If you look at the fine print, you'll see that unlimited means that the supplier may slow your speed or will throttle your usage based on network congestion or your consumption pattern. And Keith, don't get me started on the cost of Apple and Samsung devices. These things are now selling for over $1,000.
Ha! I thought they were free. No. Some mobility deals also have a lot of free things included that aren't actually free, like free phones. Oh, wait, maybe they aren't free. And penalties and payback requirements will almost always apply if certain tiny type provisions aren't met, like having a contract of a specified length or a 2-year line commitment, so forth.
I can certainly think of so many other technical and service related issues, but it also seems like account support or lack thereof is something that's becoming a big issue.
You're right, it is becoming a bigger issue. In the good old days, you had a dedicated account team that you could call on whenever you needed something. If you had service issues, billing questions, or you needed to understand what products were available to meet your need, you had this dedicated account team. I read an article recently about the AT&T of old. 40 years ago, AT&T had 1 million employees. Today, it's about a quarter of that. Now, it's not completely apples to apples, but you get the point. Those days are long gone. Clients are lucky if they get a sympathetic ear from their account team. Nowadays, if you want any sort of enhanced service or support from your account team, the suppliers are going to expect you to pay for it.
Yep, indeed. Things are running smoothly. Companies don't worry too much, or they may not even know that they have these issues that we just talked about, until they stress a solution or they do a post-mortem on a problem. Like today with conferencing, as the workforce moved home and upped its conferencing usage, we're hearing a lot of complaints about some of the products that they're using. Okay, Keith, you were right. We are out of time and we've only really scratched the surface on this issue. All right, so how about on the next episode, we bring in Deb Bowling, one of LB3's partners and someone who I know can add even more issues to our list. And then the three of us will discuss what enterprises can do about these issues using technology, improved processes, and your contract. In the meantime, if you'd like to discuss your company's ICT needs with Keith, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, please give us a call or drop us an email. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, or by following us on LinkedIn.